Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue with our Let's Read of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 1, Part 8. Peter, crouching in the front seat, saw nothing. The first thing either of them noticed was a new sound that broke into the clear air, louder than they had ever heard it before, the bell of the monastery of their own village, ringing for early prayers. Pavel and Peter drove into the village alone, and they had been alone ever since. They were run out of their village. Pavel's own mother would not look at him. They went away to strange towns, but when the people learned where they came from, they were always asked if they knew the two men who had fed the bride to the wolves. Wherever they went, the story followed them. It took them 5 years to save money enough to come to America. They worked in Chicago, Des Moines, Fort Wayne, but they were always unfortunate. When Pavel's health grew so bad, they decided to try farming. Pavel died a few days after he unburdened his mind to Mr. Shimerda and was buried in the Norwegian graveyard. Peter sold off everything and left the country, went to be cook in a railway construction camp where gangs of Russians were employed. At his sale, we bought Peter's wheelbarrow and some of his harnesses. During the auction, he went about with his head down and never lifted his eyes. He seemed not to care about anything. The Black Hawk moneylender who held mortgages on Peter's livestock was there, and he bought in the sale notes at about 50 cents on the dollar. Everyone said Peter kissed the cow before she was led away by her new owner. I did not see him do it, but this I know. After all his furniture and his cook stove and pots and pans had been hauled off by the purchasers, when his house was stripped and bare, he sat down on the floor with his clasp knife and ate all the melons that he had put away for winter. When Mr. Shimerda and Krajiek drove up in their wagon to take Peter to the train, they found him with a dripping beard surrounded by heaps of melon rinds. The loss of his two friends had a depressing effect upon old Mr. Shimerda. When he was out hunting, he used to go into the empty log house and sit there brooding. This cabin was his hermitage until the winter snows penned him in his cave. For Antonia and me, the story of the wedding party was never at an end. We did not tell Pavel's secret to anyone, but guarded it jealously as if the wolves of the Ukraine had gathered that night long ago and the wedding party had been sacrificed to give us a painful and peculiar pleasure. At night, before I went to sleep, I often found myself in a sledge drawn by 3 horses, dashing through a country that looks something like Nebraska and something like Virginia. Part 9. The first snowfall came early in December. I remember how the world looked from our sitting room window as I dressed behind the stove that morning. The low-light sky was like a sheet of metal. The blonde cornfields had faded out into ghostliness at last. The little pond was frozen under its stiff willow bushes. Big white flakes were whirling over everything and disappearing in the red grass. Beyond the pond, on the slope that climbed to the cornfield, there was, faintly marked in the grass, a great circle where the Indians used to ride. Jake and Otto were sure that when they galloped round that ring, the Indians tortured prisoners, bound to a stake in the center. But Grandfather thought they merely ran races or trained horses there. Whenever one looked at this slope against the setting sun, the circle showed like a pattern in the grass, and this morning, when the first light spray of snow lay over it, it came out with wonderful distinctness like strokes of Chinese white on canvas. The old figure stirred me as it had never done before and seemed a good omen for the winter. As soon as the snow had packed hard, I began to drive about the country in a clumsy sleigh that Otto Fuchs made for me by fastening a wooden goods box on bobs. Fuchs had been apprenticed to a cabinet maker in the old country and was very handy with tools. He would have done a better job if I hadn't hurried him. My first trip was to the post office, and the next day I went over to take Jolka and Antonia for a sleigh ride. It was a bright, cold day. I piled straw and buffalo robes into the box and took 2 hot bricks wrapped in old blankets. When I got to the Chimerdas, I did not go up to the house, but sat in my sleigh at the bottom of the draw and called. Antonia and Jolka came running out wearing little rabbit-skin hats their father had made for them. They had heard about my sledge from Ambrosch and knew why I had come. They tumbled in beside me, and we set off toward the north along a road that happened to be broken. The sky was brilliantly blue, and the sunlight on the glittering white stretches of prairie was almost blinding. As Antonia said, the whole world was changed by the snow. We kept looking in vain for familiar landmarks. The deep arroyo through which Squaw Creek wound was now only a cleft between snowdrifts, very blue when one looked down into it. The treetops that had been gold all the autumn were dwarfed and twisted, as if they would never have any life in them again. The few little cedars, which were so dull and dingy before, now stood out a strong, dusky green. The wind had the burning taste of fresh snow. My throat and nostrils smarted as if someone had opened a hartshorn bottle. The cold stung, and at the same time delighted one. My horse's breath rose like steam, and whenever we stopped, he smoked all over. The cornfields got back a little of their color under the dazzling light, and stood the palest possible gold in the sun and snow. All about us the snow was crusted in shallow terraces, with tracings like ripple marks at the edges, curly waves that were the actual impression of the stinging lash in the wind. The girls had on cotton dresses under their shawls. They kept shivering beneath the buffalo robes and hugging each other for warmth. But they were so glad to get away from their ugly cave and their mother's scolding that they begged me to go on and on as far as Russian Peter's house. The great fresh open after the stupefying warmth indoors made them behave like wild things. They laughed and shouted and said they never wanted to go home again. Couldn't we settle down and live in Russian Peter's house? Jolka asked. And couldn't I go to town and buy things for us to keep house with? All the way to Russian Peter's we were extravagantly happy, but when we turned back, it must have been about 4 o'clock, the east wind grew stronger and began to howl. The sun lost its heartening power, and the sky became gray and somber. I took off my long woolen comforter and wound it around Jolka's throat. She got so cold that we made her hide her head under the buffalo robe. Antonia and I sat erect, but I held the reins clumsily, and my eyes were blinded by the wind a good deal of the time. It was growing dark when we got to their house, but I refused to go in with them and get warm. I knew my hands would ache terribly if I went near a fire. Jolka forgot to give me back my comforter, and I had to drive home directly against the wind. The next day I came down with an attack of quinsy, which kept me in the house for nearly 2 weeks. The basement kitchen seemed heavenly safe and warm in those days, like a tight little boat in a winter sea. The men were out in the fields all day husking corn, and when they came in at noon with long caps pulled down over their ears and their feet in red-lined overshoes, I used to think they were like Arctic explorers. In the afternoons, when grandmother sat upstairs darning or making husking gloves, I read The Swiss Family Robinson aloud to her, and I felt that the Swiss family had no advantages over us in the way of an adventurous life. I was convinced that man's strongest antagonist is the cold. I admired the cheerful zest with which grandmother went about keeping us warm and comfortable and well fed. She often reminded me when she was preparing for the return of the hungry men that this country was not like Virginia, and that here a cook had, as she said, very little to do with. On Sunday she gave us as much chicken as we could eat, and on other days we had ham or bacon or sausage meat. She baked either pies or cake for us every day, unless, for a change, she made my favorite pudding, striped with currants and boiled in a bag. Next to getting warm and keeping warm, dinner and supper were the most interesting things we had to think about. Our lives centered around warmth and food and the return of the men at nightfall. I used to wonder when they came in tired from the fields, their feet numb and their hands cracked and sore, how they could do all the chores so conscientiously. Feed and water and bed the horses, milk the cows, and look after the pigs. When supper was over, it took them a long while to get the cold out of their bones. While grandmother and I washed the dishes and grandfather read his paper upstairs, Jake and Otto sat on the long bench behind the stove, easing their inside boots or rubbing mutton tallow into their cracked hands. Every Saturday night we popped corn or made taffy, and Otto Fuchs used to sing, "For I am a cowboy and know I've done wrong," or "Bury me not on the lone prairie." He had a good baritone voice and always led the singing when we went to church services at the Saad schoolhouse. I can still see those two men sitting on the bench, Otto's clipped head and Jake's shaggy hair slicked flat in front by a wet comb. I could see the sag of their tired shoulders against the whitewashed wall. What good fellows they were, how much they knew, and how many things they had kept faith with. Fuchs had been a cowboy, a stage driver, a bartender, a miner, had wandered all over that great western country and done hard work everywhere, though, as grandmother said, he had done nothing to show for it. Jake was duller than Otto. He could scarcely read, wrote even his name with difficulty, and he had a violent temper which sometimes made him behave like a crazy man, tore him all to pieces, and actually made him ill. But he was so soft-hearted that anyone could impose upon him. If he, as he said, forgot himself and swore before grandmother, he went about depressed and shamefaced all day. They were both of them jovial about the cold in winter and the heat in summer, always ready to work overtime and to meet emergencies. It was a matter of pride with them not to spare themselves. Yet they were the sort of men who never get on somehow or do anything but work hard for $1 or $2 a day. On those bitter, starlit nights, as we sat around the old stove that fed us and warmed us and kept us cheerful, we could hear the coyotes howling down by the corrals, and their hungry, wintry cry used to remind the boys of wonderful animal stories about gray wolves and bears in the Rockies, wild cats and panthers in the Virginia mountains. Sometimes Fuchs could be persuaded to talk about the outlaws and desperate characters he had known. I remember one funny story about himself that made grandmother, who was working her bread on the breadboard, laugh until she wiped her eyes with her bare arm, her hands being floury. It was like this. When Otto left Austria to come to America, he was asked by one of his relatives to look after a woman who was crossing on the same boat to join her husband in Chicago. The woman started off with 2 children, but it was clear that her family might grow larger on the journey. Fuchs said he got on fine with the kids and liked the mother, though she played a sorry trick on him. In mid-ocean, she proceeded to have not 1 baby, but 3. This event made Fuchs the object of undeserved notoriety since he was traveling with her. The steerage stewardess was indignant with him. The doctor regarded him with suspicion. The first cabin passengers who made up a purse for the woman took an embarrassing interest in Otto and often inquired of him about his charge. When the triplets were taken ashore in New York, he had, as he said, to carry some of them. The trip to Chicago was even worse than the ocean voyage. On the train, it was very difficult to get milk for the babies and to keep their bottles clean. The mother did her best, but no woman out of her natural resources could feed 3 babies. The husband in Chicago was working in a furniture factory for modest wages, and when he met his family at the station, he was rather crushed by the size of it. He, too, seemed to consider Fuchs in some fashion to blame. I was sure glad, Otto concluded, that he didn't take his hard feeling out on that poor woman. But he had a sullen eye for me, all right. Now, did you ever hear of a young feller's having such hard luck, Mrs. Burden? Grandmother told him she was sure the Lord had remembered these things to his credit, and had helped him out of many a scrape when he didn't realize that he was being protected by Providence. Part 10. For several weeks after my sleigh ride, we heard nothing from the Chimerdas. My sore throat kept me indoors, and Grandmother had a cold which made the housework heavy for her. When Sunday came, she was glad to have a day of rest. One night at supper, Fuchs told us he had seen Mr. Chimerda out hunting. He's made himself a rabbit-skin cap, Jim, and a rabbit-skin collar that he buttons on outside his coat. They ain't got but one overcoat among 'em over there, and they take turns wearing it. They seem awful scared of cold and sticking that hole in the bank like badgers. All but the crazy boy, Jake put in. He never wears a coat. Krajek says he's terrible strong and can stand anything. I guess rabbits must be getting scarce in this locality. Ambrose came along by the cornfield yesterday, where I was at work, and showed me 3 prairie dogs he'd shot. He asked me if they was good to eat. I spit and made a face and took on to scare him, but he just looked like he was smarter than me and put him back in his sack and walked off. Grandmother looked up in alarm and spoke to Grandfather. Josiah, you don't suppose Krajek would let them poor creatures eat prairie dogs, do you? You had better go over and see our neighbors tomorrow, Emmeline, he replied gravely. Fuchs put in a cheerful word and said prairie dogs were clean beasts and ought to be good for food, but their family connections were against them. I asked what he meant, and he grinned and said they belonged to the rat family. When I went downstairs in the morning, I found Grandmother and Jake packing a hamper basket in the kitchen. Now, Jake, Grandmother was saying, if you can find that old rooster that got his comb froze, just give his neck a twist and we'll take him along. There's no good reason why Mrs. Chimerda couldn't have got hens from her neighbors last fall and had a hen house going by now. I reckon she was confused and didn't know where to begin. I've come strange to a new country myself, but I never forgot hens are a good thing to have, no matter what you don't have. Just as you say, ma'am, said Jake, but I hate to think of Krajek getting a leg of that old rooster. He tramped out through the long cellar and dropped the heavy door behind him. After breakfast, Grandmother and Jake and I bundled ourselves up and climbed into the cold front wagon seat. As we approached the Chimerdases, we heard the frosty whine of the pump and saw Antonia, her head tied up and her cotton dress blown about her, throwing all her weight on the pump handle as it went up and down. She heard our wagon, looked back over her shoulder, and catching up her pail of water, started at a run for the hole in the bank. Jake helped Grandmother to the ground, saying he would bring the provisions after he had blanketed his horses. We went slowly up the icy path toward the door sunk into the draw side. Blue puffs of smoke came from the stovepipe that stuck out through the grass and snow, but the wind whisked them roughly away. Mrs. Shimerda opened the door before as we knocked and seized grandmother's hand. She did not say how do as usual, but at once began to cry, talking very fast in her own language, pointing to her feet which were tied up in rags, and looking about accusingly at everyone. The old man was sitting on a stump behind the stove, crouching over as if he were trying to hide from us. Jolka was on the floor at his feet, her kitten in her lap. She peeped out at me and smiled, but glancing up at her mother, hid again. Antonia was washing pans and dishes in a dark corner. The crazy boy lay under the only window, stretched on a gunny sack stuffed with straw. As soon as we entered, he threw a grain sack over the crack at the bottom of the door. The air in the cave was stifling, and it was very dark, too. A lighted lantern hung over the stove threw out a feeble yellow glimmer. Mrs. Shimerda snatched off the covers of 2 barrels behind the door and made us look into them. In one there were some potatoes that had been frozen and were rotting. In the other was a little pile of flour. Grandmother murmured something in embarrassment, but the Bohemian woman laughed scornfully, a kind of whinny laugh, and catching up an empty coffee pot from the shelf, shook it at us with a look positively vindictive. Grandmother went on talking in her polite Virginia way, not admitting their stark need or her own remissness, until Jake arrived with the hamper as if in direct answer to Mrs. Shimerda's reproaches. Then the poor woman broke down. She dropped on the floor beside her crazy son, hid her face on her knees, and sat crying bitterly. Grandmother paid no heed to her, but called Antonia to come and help empty the basket. Tony left her corner reluctantly. I had never seen her crushed like this before. "You must not mind my poor mamenka, Mrs. Burden. She is so sad," she whispered, as she wiped her wet hands on her skirt and took the things grandmother handed her. The crazy boy, seeing the food, began to make soft, gurgling noises and stroked his stomach. Jake came in again, this time with a sack of potatoes. Grandmother looked about in perplexity. "Haven't you got any sort of cave or cellar outside, Antonia? This is no place to keep vegetables. How did your potatoes get frozen?" "We get from Mr. Bushy at the post office. What he throw out. We got no potatoes, Mrs. Burton," Tony admitted mournfully. When Jake went out, Merrick crawled along the floor and stuffed up the door crack again. Then, quietly as a shadow, Mr. Shimerda came out from behind the stove. He stood brushing his hand over his smooth gray hair as if he were trying to clear away a fog about his head. He was clean and neat as usual, with his green neckcloth and his coral pin. He took grandmother's arm and led her behind the stove to the back of the room. In the rear wall was another little cave, a round hole not much bigger than an oil barrel scooped out in the black earth. When I got up on one of the stools and peered into it, I saw some quilts and a pile of straw. The old man held the lantern. "Jolka," he said in a low, despairing voice. "Jolka, my Antonia." Grandmother drew back. "You mean they sleep in there? Your girls?" He bowed his head. Tony slipped under his arm. "It is very cold on the floor, and this is warm like the badger hole. I like for sleep there," she insisted eagerly. My mamenka has a nice bed with pillows from our own geese in Bohemia. See, Jim?" She pointed to the narrow bunk which Krajiek had built against the wall for himself before the Shimerdas came. Grandmother sighed. "Sure enough, where would you sleep, dear? I don't doubt you're warm there. You'll have a better house after a while, Antonia, and then you'll forget these hard times." Mr. Shimerda made grandmother sit down on the only chair and pointed his wife to a stool beside her. Standing before them with his hand on Antonia's shoulder, he talked in a low tone, and his daughter translated. He wanted us to know that they were not beggars in the old country. He made good wages, and his family were respected there. He left Bohemia with more than $1,000 in savings after their passage money was paid. He had in some way lost on exchange in New York, and the railway fare to Nebraska was more than they had expected. By the time they paid Krajiek for the land and bought his horses and oxen and some old farm machinery, they had very little money left. He wished grandmother to know, however, that he still had some money. If they could get through until spring came, they would buy a cow and chickens and plant a garden, and then could do very well. Ambrose and Antonia were both old enough to work in the fields, and they were willing to work, but the snow and the bitter weather had disheartened them all. Antonia explained that her father meant to build a new house for them in the spring. He and Ambrose had already split the logs for it, but the logs were all buried in the snow along the creek where they had been felled. While grandmother encouraged and gave them advice, I sat down on the floor with Jolka and let her show me her kitten. Merrick slid cautiously toward us and began to exhibit his webbed fingers. I knew he wanted to make his queer noises for me, to bark like a dog or whinny like a horse, but he did not dare in the presence of his elders. Merrick was always trying to be agreeable, poor fellow, as if he had it on his mind that he must make up for his deficiencies. Mrs. Shimerda grew more calm and reasonable before our visit was over, and, while Antonia translated, put in a word now and then on her own account. The woman had a quick ear and caught up phrases whenever she heard English spoken. As we rose to go, she opened her wooden chest and brought out a bag made of bed ticking, about as long as a flour sack and half as wide, stuffed full of something. At sight of it, the crazy boy began to smack his lips. When Mrs. Shimerda opened the bag and stirred the contents with her hand, it gave out a salty, earthly smell, very pungent, even among the other odors of that cave. She measured a teacup full, tied it up in a bit of sacking, and presented it ceremoniously to grandmother. "For cook," she announced. "Little now, be very much when cook," spreading out her hands as if to indicate that the pint would swell to a gallon. "Very good, you no have in this country. All things for eat better in my country." "Maybe so, Mrs. Shimerda," grandmother said dryly. "I can't say, but I prefer our bread to yours myself." Antonia undertook to explain. "This very good, Mrs. Burton." She clasped her hands as if she could not express how good. "It make very much when you cook, like what Mama say, cook with rabbit, cook with chicken, in the gravy. Oh, so good." All the way home, grandmother and Jake talked about how easily good Christian people could forget they were their brother's keepers. "I will say, Jake, some of our brothers and sisters are hard to keep. Where's a body to begin with these people? They're wanting in everything, and most of all in horse sense. Nobody can give 'em that, I guess. Jimmy here is about as able to take over a homestead as they are. Do you reckon that boy Ambrose has any real push in him?" "He's a worker all right, ma'am, and he's got some catch-on about him, but he's a mean one. Folks can be mean enough to get on in this world, and then again they can be too mean." That night, while grandmother was getting supper, we opened the package Mrs. Shimerda had given her. It was full of little brown chips that looked like the shavings of some root. They were as light as feathers, and the most noticeable thing about them was their penetrating, earthy odor. We could not determine whether they were animal or vegetable. "They might be dried meat from some queer beast, Jim. They ain't dried fish, and they never grew on stalk or vine. I'm afraid of 'em. Anyhow, I shouldn't want to eat anything that had been shut up for months with old clothes and goose pillows." She threw the package into the stove, but I bit off a corner of one of the chips I held in my hand and chewed it tentatively. I never forgot the strange taste, though it was many years before I knew that those little brown shavings which the Chimerdas had brought so far and treasured so jealously were dried mushrooms. They had been gathered, probably, in some deep Bohemian forest. Part 11. During the week before Christmas, Jake was the most important person of our household, for he was to go to town and do all of our Christmas shopping. But on the 21st of December, the snow began to fall. The flakes came down so thickly that from the sitting room windows I could not see beyond the windmill. Its frame looked dim and gray, unsubstantial like a shadow. The snow did not stop falling all day or during that night that followed. The cold was not severe, but the storm was quiet and resistless. The men could not go farther than the barns and corral. They sat about the house most of the day as if it were Sunday, greasing their boots, mending their suspenders, plaiting whiplashes. On the morning of the 22nd, Grandfather announced at breakfast that it would be impossible to go to Black Hawk for Christmas purchases. Jake was sure he could get through on horseback and bring home our things in saddlebags, but Grandfather told him the roads would be obliterated and a newcomer in the country would be lost 10 times over. Anyway, he would never allow one of his horses to be put to such a strain. We decided to have a country Christmas without any help from town. I had wanted to get some picture books for Julka and Antonia. Even Julka was able to read a little now. Grandmother took me into the ice-cold storeroom where she had some bolts of gingham and sheeting. She cut squares of cotton cloth and we sewed them together into a book. We bound it between pasteboards which I covered with brilliant calico representing scenes from a circus. For 2 days I sat at the dining room table pasting this book full of pictures for Julka. We had files of those good old family magazines which used to publish colored lithographs of popular paintings, and I was allowed to use some of these. I took Napoleon announcing the divorce to Josephine for my frontispiece. On the white pages I grouped Sunday school cards and advertising cards which I had brought from my old country. Fuchs got out the old candle molds and made tallow candles.